Well, good evening, everybody. It seems, to be honest, it seems to me like 5 minutes since it was 9:30 this morning. We opened the conference, but I hope you've enjoyed the day, that you've been able to participate in many panels as you can. I was just talking to John before we came live here to say how impressed I was, and I'm sure my colleague in Sheffield, James Weinberg, was as well, at the quality of papers. I'm not just saying that. I mean, I remember being an undergraduate myself, and the thought of presenting at a conference would have been very intimidating. So congratulations to you all for presenting today and for engaging with your peers and with the sort of political science community. We're in the final session, obviously, today, and I'm extremely pleased to have a colleague and friend who is here on the screen alongside me. And this is Professor John Barry. And so Professor Barry is a professor of green political economy here at Queen's University, the same school as myself, history, anthropology, philosophy, and politics. John came to Queen's just at the turn of the century in 2000. Prior to that, he was at Keele University. And prior to that, he had a life as a student in the University of Glasgow and University College Dublin. Now, John has published extensively and continues to be very research and policy active in respect of green political theory, the politics and political economy of sustainability, greening the economy, environmental and sustainable development policymaking, environmental ethics, transition to a low carbon energy economy, the normative dimensions of the transition from sustainability. You can tell I'm reading this, can't you? I wouldn't remember it all. Theories and practices of active citizenship, democracy and green politics, and civic republicanism. John is enormously well known around Queen's, around Belfast. He's very popular amongst his peers and staff in the academic community in Queen's, but particularly so, I have to say, with students who, we always just hear about the great John Barry lectures. And John's also popular with the electorate. He was elected as a Green Party councillor in Ards and North Down Borough Council from 2014 to 18. At least he's put himself before the electorate a couple of times. And John very kindly agreed without hesitation to address the event today. So thank you very much, John. And the title that he proposed, when I said we floated some general ideas, but the title he's going to speak about is, the subject he's going to speak about is, quote, "This is what a real emergency looks like, what the response to coronavirus can teach us about how we can and need to respond to the planetary emergency." So, John, I'm going to go mute and off camera, and I'll let you speak, and I'll pop up when there's a minute or two to go, and we'll leave some time for about 15 minutes or so of Q&A. So I think everybody who's listening, you know at this stage how to send your questions in, and I'll field them to John. So without further ado, I will hand over to John to talk to you in this topic. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Murish, and good evening, everybody. You've had a long day, so I want you all to sit back, relax, and let my dulcet tones wash over you on it's a difficult topic, the issue of the planetary crisis, never mind the pandemic, but I hope to leave you intrigued, maybe seeing some connections that you perhaps haven't made between responses to the pandemic and these larger issues of the climate crisis. But also, I don't want to depress you, because this issue of picking the climate and the ecological crisis can be quite depressing. And I don't want to do that to you, particularly after a long day at a conference on a Friday. So hopefully leave you with a bit of sense of hope as well. So I'm just going to share my slides here. That's the title of what I'm going to talk about. And before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that in the context of the pandemic, we should all be very grateful for those key workers that have kept our societies going. We're not out of it yet, but I do think there is a sense in which we are, coming and getting a grip on the pandemic. In a way, you could say that's very hopeful, but also there's quite a bit of difference between our approach then to the planetary crisis, in terms of we may get over the pandemic, or at least it may become like the seasonal flu, because we have to get used to it. That is not the case with certain aspects, particularly of the ecological and climate crisis. This image, I think, really captures what I want to talk about. So this is from the Californian bushfires, which raged across that state last summer, partly exacerbated by climate breakdown and the changing weather patterns. So I'm not saying that the bushfires were caused by climate change, but what climate change is an exacerbator of already existing phenomena, both naturally and also social issues. There is a whole area of academic research looking at climate breakdown as a threat enhancer, which is of particular interest to international relations scholars and those interested in roles for the military. So here you have obviously a burning fire, and of course then you have the coronavirus information and injunction to wash your hands and so forth. Now, this is somebody that some of you may have heard of before, one of the great fathers, if you like, of neoliberalism, or very pro-free market policies, proponent of the small state, and therefore somebody that would not be my ideological cup of tea. But Milton Friedman, beloved by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s in particular, he did say, I think, something that's quite significant on the importance of a crisis, and you can read it there yourself. And the point he's making is that a crisis is an inflection point. It's an opportunity for radical changes in either the state of the economy, society, or indeed how the state system itself operates. Well, reflecting upon this over a year ago, during lockdown, I put down my thoughts in terms of what I could see already a month into lockdown about these lessons that I'm going to give you in a moment about what we can learn from the pandemic about addressing the climate emergency. And if you're interested, I wrote a short piece for the Greenhouse think tank based in the UK on this topic. So it's a longer version of what I'm going to be talking about today. The reality is the pandemic has cancelled the future. But you know what? That's okay, because it was a pretty bad one anyhow. And as you'll see towards the end, I'll be making the point that as we come out of the pandemic, we should be building back better. We should not be seeking to go back to the BC economy, the before COVID economy, because normal wasn't working. Normal was ecocidal. Normal was creating more inequalities within and between societies. So again, that idea of a crisis being an opportunity for change, we should use the pandemic, and as we come out of the pandemic, actually lay down the foundations for what I would call a low carbon, green, regenerative economy. Or in a nice phrase from the activist and author Naomi Klein, we need to move from our current economic model, which is a dig and gig economy. So it's based upon unsustainable extraction and particularly dependence upon fossil fuels, but also a very precarious workforce, Uber, Deliveroo, and so on. That dig and gig economy, I think, is deeply problematic. And where we need to get to is the care and repair economy, valuing relationships of care between people, which you see is so important in the pandemic, and repair in terms of ecosystems that have been damaged as a result of industrial capitalism. So if you want a simple way of describing the arc of what I'm trying to argue is to move from the dig and gig economy to the care and repair. Some of you may have seen this that was doing the social media rounds last year, humanity fighting the virus, but of course, waiting in the wings is the bigger challenge of climate change. I think actually a better visual representation of what we're facing is this. So we're dealing with the pandemic. Then we have the recession that is inevitable that's coming out of this in terms of joblessness, and I'll make reference to that. Then we have climate change, and even bigger than that in many respects are connected is the loss of the life-supporting systems of the planet. And the fact that, in case you didn't know, sadly, the planet is now experiencing its 6th great mass extinction event. The planet has gone through, in its evolutionary history, 5 other great mass extinction events where up to 90% of all life on the planet died out. Of course, the one we remember is the asteroid hitting the Earth that killed off the dinosaurs. So these are very challenging times that we're living in. I also think they're very exciting times to be living in terms of what are the solutions, what are the changes in how we make, how we drive, how we heat our homes. You could say even our experience this evening is an example of perhaps what a low carbon economy might look like in terms of working from home, a lot more online rather than lots of travel and so on. So again, there's lessons in the pandemic about saying, well, is this an indication of at least part of what a care and repair economy and society might look like? So the pandemic really is an opportunity to rethink. All of us in different ways, and depending on your situation, often your gender, your race, where you are in the world, we're all unevenly experiencing a sense of vulnerability, but also our interconnectedness to each other. And, I think there's been a revaluation of health given that what we're facing is a public health scare. And indeed, we do have opportunities, and I'll give you some evidence towards the end of my talk about people beginning to think that, well, why do we want to go back to the way we were before when actually it wasn't working for many people, even though there's a strong desire on behalf of many of our citizens and powerful actors, which I'll point out in a moment, to go back to exactly the way we were before in the BC economy, the before COVID economy. And what's really happened, you could say, with the pandemic is that, and it's again, my irritation when you see in the media, often from business groups complaining the economy is closed. The economy isn't closed. The economy has been reduced to its essential services to keep our societies functioning in terms of food, transportation, healthcare, electricity, and so on. And what we see is who are the essential workers in our society, the ones who can't work from home, who have to go into the factory to keep the power stations going. The drivers who are, delivering food and so on. And in a way, that's an opportunity to see, well, why are those workers who are key? We now recognize that key workers, many of us clapped for them for about 7 weeks or so in the early part of the pandemic. Why is it that these key workers are paid so little? Why are they on precarious contracts? And therefore, you can ask the question, why is somebody in the City of London pressing buttons on a screen, making currency speculation? How valuable is that in comparison to a nurse looking after somebody in an ICU unit and so on? So there are big issues here that I think the pandemic has opened up for some people, not for everybody, but I do think there's an opportunity again of a crisis, there's an opportunity to rethink. And in many respects, these two headlines in different contexts, one from The Guardian in the UK, one from India, expresses this idea that the pandemic is a warm-up act. We're flexing our muscles as societies, as states, in terms of can we see that in our response to the pandemic, that actually we can have some warranted hope that we can address these much bigger challenges of the climate and ecological crisis. But I do think we've also seen this in the pandemic. Again, multi-billionaire investor Warren Buffett, only when the tide goes out do we know who's naked. It's only, that when we see in the pandemic, we have revealed the inequalities in society, the unnecessary suffering, the levels of poverty, fuel poverty, energy poverty in our society have been revealed, I think, for everybody to see in the context of the pandemic. And we're not all in this together. I mean, again, that has been part of a strategy, a discourse that you see in the media and certainly by politicians, that somehow we're all in this together. This, of course, is a satirical play on this of millionaires and celebrities, spelling out we're all in this together on their private yachts. The reality is this, is the way in which frontline workers, and I give you an example here of a tragic case from last year of an NHS worker, dying alone in self-isolation because he had contracted the virus. And that's why I do think it's an opportunity for us almost morally to stop and think, well, who is doing valuable work? And again, I'm being slightly exaggerating here in terms of, comparing a currency speculator as to somebody who's a frontline worker in healthcare. But I do think you have to say, well, why is it one is paid low wages and often precariously employed, and yet the other person is making lots and lots of money, which you could say, is that socially useful in terms of healthcare versus making loads on currency speculation? And because at least I am in Ireland, and virtually the conference is being hosted here in Belfast, there's an interesting analogy that I'd like to trial before you here. This is a famous quote, if you've ever studied Irish politics, about the Irish Famine, the Great Irish Famine of the mid-19th century. And it's from John Mitchell, who was a Fenian and a land reform agitator. This idea that the blight which caused the potato crop to fail came from God, the Almighty, but the famine was created by policies, the English policies, given that Ireland at that time was, part of the United Kingdom, part of the Empire, and an effective colony of the UK. And the point being made here is that we shouldn't see natural emergencies such as famines or pandemics as just completely natural. There's always politics. It's the institutional response is the point of Mitchell's quote here. It was the way in which food was being shipped out of Ireland at the time of the famine. So it wasn't a lack of food, even though the crop had failed. The famine was caused by institutional political choices. And for me, trying to update this, this is what I come up with. I don't know whether it works. This idea that global capitalism created released the coronavirus in terms of Wuhan, who hands up who here had heard of Wuhan before the pandemic, but that the encroachment on more and more areas of wilderness is releasing pathogens that human beings have never come across before. That's what I mean by that idea of global capitalism releasing coronavirus. But actually it was the responses, the lack of responses by states which caused the pandemic. I could give you a whole talk on why is it that in places like Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, there was much more effective zero COVID strategies, which largely protected their populations. Whereas in Europe, in the UK, Ireland, and America, it was a kind of a living with COVID strategy, which I think actually exacerbated the pandemic. That was a political choice. So that's that idea that nature doesn't cause a lot of these problems on its own. It's how we respond politically that matters. And again, fair warning, or just to fill in, particularly given the context of Black Lives Matter, I think it is important to note that John Mitchell, the historical figure I've just quoted, was a supporter of slavery. And there's a big debate now in Newry, where he was from. This is on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, about what, again, do we do with his statue? And in the same way that you had debates about Coulson in Bristol and so on. So again, I think it's been a really important issue that Black Lives Matter has brought out, is the legacy of slavery. You could even include there maybe colonialism in our street names and our public monuments. And of course, the issue is, what do we do? Do we pull them down? Do we put up alternative signage to describe it? But I just wanted to acknowledge that this issue that has been raised by the Black Lives Matter movement is not just unique to the UK or the US. So what are some of the lessons we can learn from responses to the coronavirus crisis? Well, what we found is that states can move quickly, despite what people like Milton Friedman would have us believe, that the state was not able to move quickly enough. And in comparison to what Mrs. May, Theresa May, the former British Prime Minister, said, who said there is no magic money tree, actually we found that the state can find finance to support the NHS, to furlough workers, to go and buy vaccine for its population and so forth. It's kind of an equivalent in a way to something that's always been of curious interest to me, and maybe it's to you as well, if I put it this way. Have you ever wondered, why is there always money to buy cruise missiles and the military, but not enough money for the NHS or education? There always seems to be enough money for the state to spend on military, but not enough then to spend on healthcare, education, and so on. And in a way, the pandemic has revealed the state can, if it chooses, so again, we're back to the issue of politics, finance can be found to support people and keep them at home as a result of the public health crisis that we're in. We've also found that people can adapt fairly quickly. And we've seen that there has been, again, not universal, but there has more or less been a sense of solidarity and a collective sense of self-help, whether it's people getting to know their neighbours, looking in on their elderly relatives or people in their community. There has been a sense of solidarity, although there has been some degree of panic and fear among sections of the population. And indeed, maybe in years to come, historians will look back and describe the early part of the pandemic and the lockdown as the great toilet roll famine, when certainly here in Northern Ireland, we had people almost coming to blows in their local supermarkets trying to get the last toilet roll. I have to say, it wouldn't be the first thing on my list if I was panic buying and so on. But by and large, there has been a sense of solidarity, of people coming together, even though, as I mentioned earlier, we do need to be critical of this idea that we're all in this together. In a way, the pandemic has also revealed, again, that issue of the structural problems in our society, and indeed many of the issues that people are experiencing, negative experiences around the pandemic, is that the pandemic has traveled down existing lines of inequality. So if you're already poor and single before the pandemic, you're going to be in a worse position as a result of it. So there has been solidarity, but it's also been a revelation in a way of inequalities across societies. And I'm going to talk about this just for a moment and show you a slide in terms of how the pandemic has opened up new opportunities, perhaps, of how we can communicate effectively some complex issues. And all of these, I think, might give us some sense of what I'm calling here a warranted hope that the state and populations can respond and rise to the challenges and opportunities of the planetary crisis and begin to move away from what I call here actually existing unsustainability, because that's exactly the situation that we're in. Our societies are utterly unsustainable. We cannot continue to burn carbon, coal, oil, and gas at the rate we're doing. We're going to cook the planet. We cannot continue with the levels of consumption of resources from around the world, because it means that if we're consuming more resources, it means somebody somewhere else is not getting their fair share, and so on. The whole complicated issue of the overlap between the ecological crisis and the issue of global justice in terms of the distribution of resources to enable everybody in the human family across the planet to live a decent life. And here's an interesting way in which you can learn from the pandemic. So the graph on the left may be familiar to you. It's not as prominent now in the public messaging around the pandemic and responses to it, but certainly at the early part of the pandemic last year, we were all being urged to flatten the curve, that the whole point of us washing our hands, social distancing, working from home, and so on, was to make sure that the peak of the virus wasn't going to overwhelm national healthcare systems. But I think that idea of flattening the curve can also be read over to what I'm calling here bending the curve down. But the curve this time is greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide emissions. And this could be an effective way to communicate to the public about our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from, maybe flying less, maybe eating less red meat, cycling rather than driving. All of these will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, this would show us then ways that our efforts are bearing fruit, as it were. And indeed, you could go a bit further and say, well, can we use this type of visualization to actually mapping inequality, in terms of energy poverty being reduced as a result of various actions that the state can engage in. Some of the other lessons that we can learn is that science and expert knowledge can unevenly, and I'll give you one or two examples where it hasn't been, but we can see where science can inform public policy responses and people and populations can go along with whatever the epidemiological and medical evidence is telling them. Suddenly, once impossible policies where, for example, a conservative government in the UK is implementing what you could call quasi-socialist policies of paying workers 80% of their wages to stay at home, which if you had said that 2 years ago, people would have said you were crazy. But because of the crisis, this has been the response that once impossible policies are now not only possible, but absolutely necessary to keep society functioning. And we've seen, bizarrely, there's been positive environmental and climate impacts, whether it's fish returning to the sea in Venice, for example. Air quality has improved across most major cities, although it's starting to change now as people are driving back more. And perhaps most bizarrely, that in China, you can see NASA photographs from space taken in November, December 2019, so before the pandemic really hits in China, and then comparing them to the early part of 2020. And it's like chalk and cheese. In the 2019 aerial space photographs, there's lots of black smog because of the coal-fired power plants, whereas in January, February, March, it's all clear. In fact, there are some studies, and this is a really bizarre impact of the virus. There are some studies that show more people may have had their lives saved in China as a result of the virus than have died from the virus itself. And these were people whose lungs and respiratory problems have now not been damaged because of them not breathing, or at least for a couple of months, they've not been breathing in acrid smoke and breathing in bad air. Again, the evidence isn't conclusive, but certainly, there's been a benefit to some people in terms of their health of what's happened in terms of not having to, breathe in air that's polluted. And of course, we've had massive negative impacts. There is an argument that many people are unemployed, but they just don't know it already. And we are certainly going to face a very difficult economic transition as we come out of the pandemic, and particularly around unemployment. Well, there's one example of the uneven application of science. This is the bold Donald Trump, who, if you recall, when he was president last year and the virus hit, at one point was encouraging the citizens to drink detergent as a way of getting rid of the virus, which of course led then to many medics having to publicly come out and say, please don't do this. This will kill you or make you ill. But there are some differences between the pandemic and the planetary crisis. The first one is, unlike the virus, people, and what I'm really getting at, people like us, people who live in European northern countries, we don't see the impacts of climate breakdown, which is happening in other parts of the world. I mean, occasionally it comes on the news that there's some kind of mega event, there's a typhoon or a hurricane that's been exacerbated in terms of its energy as a result of climate breakdown or flooding. But generally speaking, climate breakdown is already impeding people's lives in the global south, but we don't necessarily know what's going on. Whereas with the pandemic, we have white European people dying in their thousands and their hundreds of thousands. The privileged northern part of the globe we can see it, whereas the planetary crisis is happening somewhere else to other people and so on. And of course, another big difference is that we don't have anybody lobbying to keep the pandemic going, whereas we do have quite significant powerful actors wanting to continue our dependence upon carbon energy, which is the major source of planetary breakdown and the climate crisis in particular. And there's just some examples of the eye-watering amounts of money that is spent by the top 5 oil companies in the world in terms of lobbying. So the science is pretty clear. So climate science is telling us we need to move away from coal, oil, and gas. That's clearly a threat to the business models of these oil companies. And there is an argument to be said that the delay on climate action is in large part, not completely, in large part due to the power of oil firms to delay, to block, to spread this misinformation around climate breakdown, and indeed to lobby governments not to go so quickly on instituting aggressive decarbonization programs. But some of the lessons that others have said, I'm not the only person who's seen this connection between the pandemic and the planetary crisis. Here's one from the US CNN Weather Channel. Again, they argue that science denial can be deadly. So again, the connection that if we deny climate science, it's going to be really bad for us and particularly our grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the future. In a similar way, to deny the science of the pandemic can leave you open to risk of getting ill or indeed death. There's also another link that's made in this particular article that the cure is global. So just in the same way the pandemic was a global effort, although we've seen a kind of vaccine nationalism emerge since. But in the same way that the search for a virus was a global effort, similarly, we need international agreement to address the planetary crisis. But at the same time, your chances of survival in both cases depend upon local decisions made by the state in which you are actually living in. Third issue, certainly, yes, individual behavior is important, social distancing in the pandemic, but actually it's the vaccine that's going to save more lives. In the same way, you recycling more or you putting up solar panels on your house is good, but actually this is a much bigger issue. It's a structural change in the nature of our economies, largely based upon 3 C's, I would say, that are the major problem in terms of the planetary crisis. The first C I've mentioned already, which is carbon. The second C, which I kind of hinted at, is consumerism and overconsumption of resources and materials, particularly by the global north. And the last C is capitalism. So it's basically carbon, consumerism, and capitalism is a toxic mix, which you can see is, in my view, the root causes of our planetary crisis. Again, this article confirmed a point that I made earlier, that populations can move quickly. And indeed, this idea of a threat multiplier, that climate change exacerbates and increases threats in the same way the pandemic does, but actually the health of the planet is the most important determinant of whether or not you've got a healthy body. Or here's another more academic piece that was produced last August in terms of, again, 5 lessons from COVID for climate change mitigation. These are different lessons. The first is that delay is costly. So the more we delay moving on the pandemic, well, guess what? People are going to die. The same way with climate breakdown. The more we delay aggressive action, it's going to get more costly, but also it's going to mean more suffering. The reality here is that you fix the roof when it's sunny. You don't wait till it's raining. That's already too late. So you try and get in and do these changes as quickly and as soon as the problem arises. We also have to be driven by science, not necessarily by ideology. That's the second point this particular article makes. Third one is that we need to attend to justice and inequality, because they can become exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic has made poor people's lives even worse, in the same way that climate breakdown makes people, particularly in the global south, who are already living precarious lives, they're living even more precarious lives as a result of climate breakdown. And this big issue that across everything today is that both the pandemic and the planetary crisis requires effective global cooperation. And we also need to be transparent in the same way that, many states have had epidemiologists, chief scientific officers, chief medical officers to show the scientific reasoning and being transparent. And not completely, there's always been politics involved in this as well. But certainly when it comes to the climate crisis, we need more scientists to be telling politicians and populations why we need to move away from our current unsustainable forms of economic activity and an unsustainable economic model. And this has led then, just to begin to wind up and give us a chance to have some Q&A, is that people say out of the pandemic, as we come out of it, this is a time for a great reset, that we can build back better and have a green and inclusive and just recovery and lay down the foundations for a different type of society and economy. The nearest equivalent to which we've had historically is what happened after the Second World War in Britain and many other countries, where the welfare state was, as a result of that calamitous crisis in wartime. Well, can we not use what we're now experiencing in the pandemic to do something similar, to create a different type of society rather than go back to the one that we left before the pandemic hit? And that's why there's lots of arguments from, international bodies around a Green New Deal, that we need to institute a green recovery program. Here's two examples. Sadly, now looking at it, I should have been more gender inclusive, but they're from two men. The first one is Fatih Birol, who's the chief executive of the IEA, the International Energy Agency. Again, everybody says that, stimulus packages by governments need to be in a green direction because they create more jobs. And this has been echoed then by the man on the bottom, Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, again, pushing this idea that as we come out of the pandemic, this is the time for a new infrastructure and green energy, to retrofit homes, to keep people out of energy poverty and fuel poverty, create jobs, keep more money in the local community, and so on. So there are many good economic arguments that actually the best bang for your buck, if you're a government, is to invest in things like renewable energy, is to invest in, insulating houses, because they deliver more jobs, they actually create more value, as well as then reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the argument then for a green and inclusive recovery. So we should build back better, and we can address multiple problems if we do this. Absolutely, we're going to need jobs. And listen out for debates in the media about any post-pandemic recovery. Are they talking about growth, that kind of economic growth, GDP? Or are they talking about jobs? I would say that what we need is a jobs-led recovery and not a growth-led recovery. We can also address inequality and the extreme inequality our societies have experienced right across the Western world, at least since the 1980s. We can also address issues of energy poverty, as I say, particularly through simple things like retrofitting homes, which is going to provide a lot of jobs and keep people out of energy poverty. We can absolutely see that poor air quality is something that we can address, and I'm going to talk about why that's so important in terms of some recent research that just come out. We can address issues of food insecurity in a similar way as we can address, energy inequality and poverty. And indeed, we can defend the welfare state. That's a more of an ideological position I would have, in that since the 1980s, the welfare state has been subject to attack, austerity, a kind of a neoliberal view that the state should get out of people's lives, and therefore you should privatize as much as we can. Leads to a situation that many of you, particularly if you're embarking on a university career, you have to pay for going to college or university. That wasn't always the case And that's as a result of a retrenchment of the welfare state. So there's an opportunity now as we come out of the pandemic, and in particular, and I'll just say this without further argument, for us to effectively address the planetary crisis, we're going to need a bigger state, a more effective state. We've seen that the pandemic has shown it's the state that saves people. It's not the free market, despite what Boris Johnson let the cat out of the bag there the other day, where he said it was capitalism and greed that created the vaccine and then immediately tried to withdraw it. But the point stands that the state is the most effective institution to protect people, and that's its first duty. The first duty of any state is to protect its citizens. And we absolutely need to regulate the financial sector. That's just more of an academic interest of mine. But again, I'll just leave it there. If people want to pick up on the Q&A, we can come back to it. And of course, in doing all of these things, we also address the climate and ecological and biodiversity crisis. And the reason why air quality is so important, this is a piece of research that's just literally come out last month, February the 9th. Just look at that figure. Fossil fuel air pollution is responsible for more than 8 million deaths in 2018 when this piece of research that was done. And that's basically 1 in 5 people across the planet in terms, I mean, it's massive. So this is an energy economy globally based upon coal, oil, and gas, and also the burning of other fuels, particularly inside for cooking, which then people are breathing in, and therefore their lives are blighted. If not, then they die. So we have an energy system which is not only killing people, it's actually killing the planet. So therefore, we need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, but we're up against some very powerful actors, i.e. the fossil fuel industry. And just to give you a sense of the distribution of these deaths around the world, here's a map. And you can see, look at the concentrations in India, and particularly in Eastern China, because that's where most of the factories are. And again, not to make you guilty, but to show you that under globalization, many of the goods produced in those factories, powered by coal, causing these deaths, end up on our markets and the shelves of our supermarkets. But actually, you can also see that there are significant hotspots of deaths from fossil fuels in parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. And look at England in particular. I probably should have zoned in to show you more, and also parts of America, but it's largely concentrated in the global south. But it's a staggering figure that 1 in 5 people who died in 2018 died as a result of fossil fuel air pollution. And there's lots of support for a Building Back Better campaign. This is taken a while ago, a year ago, in terms of 58% in Britain want to see the pandemic, and as we come out of it, as a way of engaging in a green stimulus package, a green recovery, much higher, of course, in India and so on at the top there in 81. And indeed, even Boris Johnson has gone the bandwagon of this. And just in December, he outlined his new green industrial revolution, in November last year, in terms of a new hydrogen economy. He did also propose nuclear power, which I have issues with. I do believe in nuclear power, but the nuclear power from the sun. We don't need nuclear power if we actually, have more energy efficient measures. That's a whole other issue. But sadly, even all this government effort, and Joe Biden is spending whatever is over $1 trillion in the stimulus package in relation to the pandemic, it still falls far short of what government spent after the global financial crisis of 2008. So even all this money is insufficient, and it's a mark of how you could say the lack of emergency with which the planetary crisis is being met. An interesting issue I didn't mention already is that most of you probably don't know this, but if you live in the UK or Ireland, did you know that your national parliaments declared climate and ecological emergencies in 2019? So in May 2019, the British Parliament declared a climate and ecological emergency. A week later, the Irish Parliament did. So this is all before the pandemic. So they declared these emergencies. How do we know? How have our lives been changed? The whole point, in a way, of my argument is the pandemic is what an emergency looks like, where the state enforces rules to make us change our lives, where publics can respond to that, and again, unevenly, but for the most part, go along, and we know the reasons why we're washing our hands, we're working from home, we're socially distancing. That's what a real emergency looks like. So in which case, it leads us then to think that those declarations of emergencies in the British Parliament and the Irish Parliament is just rhetoric. The politicians who declared them didn't really follow through. And that's an issue, of course, that we as citizens need to take into account, particularly those of us like me, and I'm sure many of you listening to me, are equally concerned about the climate and the future of our planet. We should demand our parliaments and our politicians to deliver. Well, what does a climate emergency plan look like for the UK? What does a climate emergency plan look like for Ireland? And also you could look up your local council area, because at last reckoning, about 2/3 of councils across Britain and Ireland have also declared these emergencies. But again, how do we know what action has been taken commensurate with this idea of a declaration of an emergency? And sadly, despite all of the planes being grounded, people not driving, and so on, the pandemic has had a very modest impact on CO2, carbon dioxide. And this shows you the scale. So even if a global pandemic cannot get us on track, that scientists tell us that we need to reduce our dependence upon fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it just shows you the scale of where we need to go. Now, for me, that's an exciting possibility. It's about trying to come up with new ways, new products, innovations, new ways of working, and so forth that are commensurate with reducing our CO2 emissions so that we get on top of the planetary crisis. And I think we also need a just transition so that no communities are left behind in the transition to a low carbon economy. And we have to also see that we have to retire fossil fuels, that the continuing use of coal, oil and gas is incompatible with a habitable planet, and how are we going to deal with the issue of a climate breakdown. So that's where governments can use their bailout packages, and they're bailing out many industries. Well, if the airline industry wants to be bailed out, and there are many jobs in there and so on, what's the airline industry doing to make sure it's playing its part in reducing its CO2 emissions, for example? So governments should have conditionality attached to any bailout, particularly for carbon intensive industry sectors. And absolutely, we need more things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, ways in which citizens at the local level in particular can be involved in co-creating a transition to a low carbon, green and inclusive economy. Now, it's a big if, but it might be that if there's a popular support, and you like what I had to say or parts of it, that we can build back better, and that we don't want to go back to the way before for this green and just recovery, we might, just might, begin to see that it's easier now to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. Because sadly, for most of you, particularly young people, all you've ever known is capitalism, this current system that we have. And that actually for many of you, it's much easier to believe in an apocalyptic future than it is to believe that we can change the way our current system is structured. And that's why I think while we should always be mindful of what James Baldwin here, a great African-American thinker and novelist, not everything that is faced is overcome or changed, but we can't change anything until we face it. We have to be telling the truth, as Extinction Rebellion would say, tell the truth about what we're facing in terms of the climate crisis. People are grown up and they can deal with that, but we can't face it unless we tell the truth about what we're doing. And I'll leave you lastly with a quote from one of my favorite Irishmen, apart from my colleague Murrish. This is George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright and novelist. And you can read it there yourself, that actually what we need now is much more imagination. And that's how I'd interpret what he means by unreasonable here, not to accept business as usual, but actually a step change to create a different type of society that's fit for purpose for the future and for the lives that you who are listening to me, young people, are going to inherit and inhabit in the years to come. So I leave it there, and more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, John. It's really, well, first of all, thank you for such a brilliant presentation, not just orally, but actually the slides you put together, which I know you did for today. And I think everybody can see, as I mentioned, why John's lectures amongst our students here in Queen's are so popular, because he really brings things right up to date, and no better man to link complex theories with real world action. In fact, there's not many people who can connect two massive issues, the pandemic and climate change, and somehow work in the toilet roll famine into the middle of it, which was a very real thing for a while. And of course, Milton Friedman as well always makes an appearance. So thank you, John. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everybody who I know you can't see on the screen here in front of you, but the questions have been flying in here. So I'll just pitch them to you, John, if that's okay. And
Sure.
I'm sorry, Nora, it's very difficult, obviously, to be put on the spot with these things, but some of them I'm sure you've just digested before in your own mind. So first of all, from Lali, a question here. How does the public mobilize to eradicate and find ways to hold to account the selective approach to governance of the planet and climate change? Will it take a catastrophic natural disaster for greater numbers to push for greater focus on the health of the planet? Is that okay?
I sincerely hope not. I mean, there was an experience of this some years ago that in America, in Hurricane Katrina, which smacked into New Orleans in 2005, and that was seen as a climate-related event. And people did think that, well, in political science, we'd call it a focusing event, that something disastrous like that will focus people's minds and America would accept the reality of climate breakdown and do something about it. It didn't happen. I mean, there's a whole set of complicated reasons under the George Bush presidency, but there's also was a racialized content to the impact in New Orleans and so on. I rather think that it's going to take massive mobilization by millions of citizens around the world to non-violently demand that their governments do better, because people are dying already as a result of the planetary crisis. And I do take inspiration from people like Greta Thunberg and the young people striking for climate, or indeed Extinction Rebellion. But even more than that, older social movements, because again, to be political sciencey, both the Youth Strike for Climate and Extinction Rebellion are what's called new social movements. But there are older social movements like the trade union movement who are now beginning to see that there are no jobs on a dead planet. And they're very heavily involved now in saying, how do we transition our coal workers into green renewable jobs? Because they can see there's no future in a carbon based economy. And if you're interested, in the UK, the Scottish government established a Just Transition Commission, which is to look at this issue, because Scotland's obviously very heavily dependent upon oil, picking up in Aberdeen and so on. And that actually they produced their report just this week, if you're interested, in terms of some ideas. But for me, both as an academic and as much as a father and as an activist, I don't think the current policy system is going to be enough. The system isn't broke, it was made that way. It's going to require the type of citizen mobilization that we saw, for example, in the suffragettes, or civil rights. This is what it's going to require, in my view. And I actually think there was a head of steam building up before the pandemic hit in terms of actions by, the Youth Strike movement, Extinction Rebellion. And then, of course, with the pandemic, there's no more, social mobilization. I hope that continues to grow as we come out of the pandemic and that movement increases.
Okay, thanks for that. So a more, I guess, action-focused question here next. So in the UK, this is from Michelle. In the UK, the public was much more compliant around obeying lockdown and other restrictions than expected. Have you any opinion on why this was the case, but also whether what worked in terms of leadership, the mission, communications can be harnessed to address our climate emergency? So I guess is there any learning from the immediacy, the emergency of COVID that can be bottled and used in the context of the much greater crisis, the climate crisis?
Yeah, well, of course, I could be flippant and say it's a quintessentially English trait, to be compliant and to queue and to be orderly and to do what you're told and so on. That I don't think was the issue. I think people were intelligent enough to make their own judgment that they saw this as a major crisis and therefore it's reasonable to work at home, wash our hands and so on, despite the fact that Boris Johnson's government obviously is not universally popular and he himself is not often trusted. But despite that, having, for example, the chief medical and scientific officers with him at his daily briefing, I think that certainly enhanced people's trust in what they were hearing. I believe, and again, I don't know for sure, but I think in some states, politicians were removed completely from the daily or weekly briefings. Because if you think about it, what does Boris Johnson or the Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin, what do they know about epidemiology? not very much. They're not experts in this area, and so it's an interesting issue. And I'm sure there's going to be academic colleagues who are writing or who have written about this as to whether or not it's better in the context of a crisis like this or the climate crisis. Just get the scientists, let them tell us what's going on, as opposed to politicizing it. And so forth. So I think it was that people could make up their own mind. They could see the impact of both what was happening with the virus and also the positive impact of their actions in terms of bringing down the ore rate and so on. And I think there's still established trust between citizens and state institutions. They may not, for example, and this is very quintessentially a character of the UK, citizens may not trust the government, but they love and trust the NHS. And so long as you have the NHS in there as part of a driving force behind any policy, I think people will get behind it.
Oh, it's really interesting. I'm going to jump to, there's two questions here from Adam, which I'll put together as a slightly different take on this, so or dimension to the presentation. So what role does the international community play over key areas of the planet that are crucial to combating climate change, like the Brazilian rainforest, Siberian permafrost, and the deep oceans, especially when the leaders of these countries may not be interested in the science or the policies? And he's a second question which related, which is about, what role then do international organizations like the UN and the broader international community? So yeah, if it's the international community and its effect on domestic national politics and policy?
I mean, it's a massively complex issue. It's an excellent question. I mean, it really is the reason why you should study international relations in terms of here is a collective action problem. Because we have almost 200 states on the planet, we don't have a world government. The UN doesn't have any jurisdiction to go to Jair Bolsonaro and say, hey, stop burning the forest, or go to Vladimir Putin and say, stop your activities which are causing the permafrost to melt in the high Arctic and so on. And it's because we have nation states with territorial autonomy, and it's established in international law that they can do whatever they want within their territory and so on, ecologically speaking. But of course, the burning of the Brazilian rainforest just doesn't impact on Brazilians, it affects us all, given that, the Brazilian rainforests are the lungs of the world. They sequester, suck in carbon and provide air. And we have no established mechanisms internationally that would compel states which are engaging in negative environmental actions which have global impacts beyond maybe finger wagging. You could imagine, though, if there was, say, a major impact of what Bolsonaro was doing on the American public, would there be trade sanctions that a Biden administration would impose upon Brazil to stop them to do what it is they're doing? So we're up against the old conundrum in international relations, is how do we compel nation states, which by their nature are often internally focused on their own populations and have their own set of interests, how do you get them to act in the global interest? Now, on the good news, just to finish, we do have examples of that in the Paris 2015 climate agreement, where we have had, at last count, almost every country in the world has signed up to, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it can be a bit like declarations of the climate emergency. It could be a bit like the Irish football team, great on paper, not so good on grass. Other teams are available, which is why you should always, as students of politics, as citizens of states, don't just listen to what politicians or leaders say. What are they doing? But it's that issue, how do we combine that question of integrating collective action globally, which is going to benefit everybody, but also respecting the territorial integrity of different sovereign states?
Well, actually, and we really are clean out of time, John, so I'll just try and get one or two quick fire questions to you. But just following on that very point, and this is a UK-focused one from James here. In light of worrying recent developments in the UK that have seen overseas development aid cut and the official closure of DFID, the Department of Foreign, sorry, I can't remember the answer, I think you know it is. How can we ensure a green climate recovery strategy that doesn't disadvantage countries in the global south at a time when the economic, social and health disparities are so very large?
Well, a start would be, a campaign to end this kind of vaccine nationalism. The sad reality is there are countries in the global south who are, often considerably poorer than our societies, who just haven't got access to the virus. They have access to the virus, but not access to the vaccine. And private pharmaceutical companies, the likes of Pfizer and AstraZeneca, are preventing these countries from making generic forms of the vaccine. Now, that's a citizen-led initiative that could put pressure on the likes of Britain. Whether that would happen, I seriously doubt it, just given the ideological disposition of the current government. And it is, regrettable that it doesn't even go far enough in terms of Britain almost now, with the reduction of its overseas development budget and, the erosion now of DFID, it's almost like it turning it in itself. And yet the language of Brexit was Britain as a global player, reasserting its place in the world. And now we have it cutting its ties and obligations, I would say, to those who are less developed in the world. So I think it's going to take, again, political action by citizens. Ask your MP, what are you doing about this? Ask your local councillor and your council, are they having notices of motion, calling out and condemning this UK government decision?
John, I completely forgot, and I just got a message from a very helpful Sean here in supporting us, that this video will actually automatically shut. So I think I better, I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but I think we've extracted enough blood from you here and energy. So thank you so much, John, for preparing the presentation. I know you don't have an audience in front of you, but I know a lot of people have been watching, but thanks for your time. A lot more to follow. And John, I know, is very open to emails, communications. You can follow him on Twitter. And as you can see, a man on a mission, and certainly want to keep watching. I won't say to watch, we all keep watching, John. But thank you for your time, John. Thank everybody who's tuned in, and I hope you have found the day interesting, stimulating, intellectually useful, practically useful for your academic work, and that you stay involved with the Political Studies Association and keep engaging with these topics, because we need people like you to be engaged, as John has said, if we're going to address these problems. So at this stage, I think we can draw things to a close. So thank you, John. As we'd say.
No, back. Well, take care, everybody. Educate, agitate, organise, wash your hands, stay safe, and socially distance from neoliberalism. Have a good weekend.